The Little Prince and the Pilot. Once upon a time, when he was just 6 years old, a gifted boy decided to be an artist. His very first childhood drawing wasn't one of the sun, flowers, or his parents. It was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. When he proudly showed it to the adults around him, many of them congratulated him on his drawing of a hat. Confused by their inability to recognize the story he was telling with his art, he moved on to drawing number 2. He drew a cross-section of a boa constrictor with an elephant inside it, so it would be quite obvious even to grown-ups. While other children were excited by his drawing, the adults he showed it to shook their heads. It was tiresome for the children to constantly explain things to adults. They encouraged the young boy to give up drawing and the arts altogether. "Why don't you try focusing on geography, arithmetic, or grammar instead?" they said. So instead of pursuing the arts, he turned his attention to becoming a pilot. At least then he'd be able to soar high above the clouds and see the world from a new perspective. Because the one perspective he had that was unmoving was his perception of adults. Although claiming to be concerned with important things, these grown-ups were just too sensible for their own good. To test this, he would show every adult he encountered his drawing number 1, and every adult that saw the drawing would, without fail, say that the drawing was of a hat. Hence, the boy knew they lacked true understanding, and that he could not talk to these adults about rainforests or stars or the random, fanciful thoughts that made their way through his mind. Instead, he could only talk to them about sensible things like politics and neckties. For quite some time, the pilot was lonely in this world of adults. But then one fateful day, everything changed. 'Cause on that day, he solemnly decided to embark on a solo journey. He hopped in his own little plane and took to the skies high above the world. He could often find a kind of peace that seemed impossible to reach on the ground. He loved sailing high above the cottony clouds, feeling the weight of gravity disappear beneath him as he lifted higher and higher into the heavens. He loved the way the golden sun reflected off the tops of the clouds, causing them to shimmer and shine in that breathtaking orange glow. He loved the way the world looked so small yet so magical at the same time. He could see raging rivers be reduced to a lace of blue and turquoise winding its way through the countryside. He could watch the mountains as they transformed from towering, otherworldly behemoths to craggy bumps rising up out of the earth, bringing with them a mosaic of greens and browns and tans. Looking out over the countryside as a whole was something that always took his breath away. He could see from those craggy mountain cliffs all the way to the sparkling sea in the distance that stretched on and on to the horizon. But on this fateful day, the pilot was flying somewhere that was perhaps even more remarkable. He took to the skies high above the Sahara Desert, one of the most isolated, desolate, and lonely places in the world. But up from the sky, it was also one of the most beautiful. The desert sand was a stunning array of colors and shapes. The sand was utterly smooth and without blemishes for miles on end, like an endless sea of calm. Then out of nowhere, giant dunes seemed to reach up to kiss the baby blue sky. There were trails in the sand, swirls, and brilliant designs that made it seem like nature itself was using the sand as its artistic canvas. The pilot loved every second of flying over the Sahara Desert. It reminded him of the magic and beauty of the world, but he never expected that he would be seeing this wild and wonderful landscape up close and personal. Suddenly, his plane began to creak and groan in the air. He began to lose altitude, and it became incredibly apparent that his plane was going down. As calmly as possible, he clung to the controls and guided the plane down to the sand. He watched as the dunes grew closer and closer to him until they were towering over him. He landed with a crash, sending sand flying up into the simmering air in giant plumes. It wasn't the most pleasant landing, but he was relieved to find that he was all right. He hadn't been injured in the crash. However, his plane's engine was broken. He stumbled out onto the sand, listening to the crunch of it underneath his boots. It was clear that his plane wasn't going to be flying anytime soon. He found himself in quite a predicament. From the sky, he had seen that there were no people, no homes, no resources for miles, and here he was with few supplies and no one to look to for help. Or was there someone to look to for help? It was when he was doodling with a pencil and paper that he first realized he wasn't alone. A small, odd little voice chimed, "Can you draw a sheep?" Surprised, the pilot turned to see a small person standing before him. The little prince was petite, with bright blonde hair and curious eyes. At first, the pilot was uneasy about seeing such a young man in the desert. He knew that he would have to feed the child, care for the child, and help the child find his way home. Although there was something very strange about him, the little prince didn't have a look of fear on his face at all. He didn't appear to be a boy concerned about being lost in the desert. The pilot told the little prince that he couldn't draw a sheep, but he could draw something else. With a smile beneath the searing desert sun, the pilot drew his drawing number 1 for the little prince. The little prince took the picture in his tiny hands and exclaimed, "No, I don't want an elephant inside a boa constrictor. They are too dangerous and big. I need a sheep." The pilot drew the little prince sheep after sheep after sheep, but the little prince rejected each drawing, saying it wasn't the sheep he was looking for. Finally, running out of patience, the pilot drew a picture of a box with a smile. He handed the drawing to the little prince, telling him that the box contained the exact sheep that he was looking for. The little prince hugged the picture, overjoyed. It was exactly what he had been hoping for. He wondered aloud if the sheep would have enough grass to eat in his box. After all, the box the sheep was living in was quite small, but the pilot was much less concerned about the imaginary sheep in the imaginary box. He tried to ask the little prince where he came from, but the prince wasn't interested in answering questions. He was only interested in asking them. The little prince inspected the plane with childlike wonder, poking and prodding the metal pieces, the look of awe sparkling in his eyes. He asked the pilot what the purpose of the plane was. "It allows me to fly through the sky," the pilot responded. A warm, comforted smile washed over the little prince's face. He was relieved to hear that he, too, came from the sky. He asked what planet he was from, much to the pilot's surprise. In turn, the pilot posed the same question to the little prince, wondering if that would explain his presence in the desert. But strangely, the little prince didn't answer. Instead, he admired his drawing with a smile on his face, thanking the pilot once more for drawing him such a wonderful sheep. "Do you want me to draw a post and a rope to the sheep so he doesn't get lost?" the pilot asked, but the little prince just chuckled, telling him that his planet was so small that there was no way the sheep could get lost. That was the pilot's first clue about where this little boy had come from. After looking at some astronomy maps, he determined that the boy was from asteroid B612, a tiny asteroid that was discovered way back in 1909. But that is only a detail that matters to grown-ups, because the pilot knew that grown-ups can only understand facts and figures. They don't care about true and real qualities in things. They measure the beauty of things based on their age or their price. Everything else is lost to them. They don't see a sheep in a box on a tiny planet. They see a square on a piece of paper, searing under the sun of the Sahara Desert. The next few days proved to be some of the most interesting of the pilot's life. The little prince and the pilot spent all their time together, working on the plane and walking through the sand nearby. With each sunset they watched and each sunrise that awakened them, they grew closer and closer together, and the pilot found out more and more about where this strange little boy came from. On the third day of their encounter, the little prince explained why he wanted the sheep in the first place. He wanted the sheep to eat the baobab seedlings that were sprouting on his planet. Baobabs are gigantic, beautiful trees with strong roots that weave their way through the soil. They are majestic, with tall, lofty branches and leaves that cast shade across big swaths of land. But there was a problem with the baobab trees. They could split the prince's planet into tiny pieces with their powerful roots, and it was the prince's job to make sure that didn't happen. He explained that all planets have good plants and bad plants, and it's important for people to remain vigilant and take care of bad plants as soon as they begin to grow to avoid future disasters. The pilot couldn't help but notice how much insight the prince possessed about the world, thanks to those powerful, beautiful baobab trees. As they discussed the baobab trees, the two sat down in the sand to watch the sun make its way down over the horizon. The little prince was mesmerized by the colors before them, the way the sunset painted the sky, a beautiful mosaic of pinks, reds, oranges, and purples, making the horizon and the sand dunes around them come alive with color. In a tiny voice, he told the pilot that on his planet, you could see the sunset whenever you want by simply moving a few feet. One day, he explained he saw the sunset 44 times. Only then did the pilot realize how incredibly small the little prince's planet truly was. As the sun finally swept over the horizon on that day, the pilot found himself watching as the little prince drifted off to sleep. He seemed so small in this vast, endless desert. He couldn't imagine the young boy with such a vivid imagination, this young boy who felt things so deeply, being here all by himself. When the fifth day rose upon them, the pilot knew he had to get to work. The plane still wasn't working, and their food and water were rapidly running out. He spent the majority of the morning trying to piece the engine together and get it working. Meanwhile, the little prince paced around looking at his sheep drawing with concern. He asked the frustrated, busy pilot if the sheep will eat both bushes and flowers on his planet. "Sheep will eat anything," the pilot replied. The little prince's concern only grew. "Even flowers with thorns? What good are thorns if they aren't going to protect the flowers?" he mused. But the pilot could not think of flowers, nor sheep, nor distant planets, nor the sweet questions of the universe that begged to be answered. All he could think of was their survival. Frustrated with their situation, he lashed out at the little prince, telling him he was busy with important matters. The little prince balled his tiny hands into fists, wounded and angry. "Important matters? You're acting like a grown-up," he declared. "If someone loves a flower, of which just one example exists among all the millions and millions of stars, that is enough to make him happy. When he looks at the stars, he tells himself, 'My flower is up there somewhere.' But if the sheep eats the flower, then for him, it is as if suddenly all the stars went out. And that isn't important." The pilot stopped working on the plane, the words washing over him in a powerful wave, and immediately after, the little prince began to sob. The pilot glided to his side and took the young boy in his arms, comforting him. Getting out of the desert was indeed important, but his new friend's happiness was the most important matter of all. After all they had in the world right now was each other and the stories shared between them. "The flower will be just fine, I promise," the pilot whispered, soothing his young companion. "What if I draw a muzzle on the sheep while you tell me about this beautiful flower of yours?" The prince smiled, wiping the tears away from his bright blue eyes. He plopped down in the sand and turned his gaze up into the sky, into the universe where, somewhere, his beloved flower remained. One day, he explained, he discovered a new plant sprouting on his planet. At first he feared it may be a new type of baobab, But as he watched it grow day after day, it became clear that it was far, far from the baobabs he was used to seeing. The plant soon revealed itself to be a rose amidst the inky blackness of space. She was a glowing beacon of beauty, a splash of red against the sea of darkness. Her beauty overwhelmed the little prince at once. He had never seen a plant like her before, and she brought him great joy. She told him that she was the only flower of her kind in the entire universe, and she was the most beautiful of all plants. She was indeed a beautiful creature, though she was vain. Day after day, she demanded that the little prince take care of her. He watered her to keep her hydrated and vibrant, put a globe over her at night to keep her warm and toasty, made a screen to protect her from the wind that threatened to bend her petals. And though he was serving her day in and day out, the prince loved her dearly. But one day, the prince caught the rose lying to him. She mentioned how where she came from was less windy. Though the prince watched her sprout up on his planet, her minor lie made the prince doubt everything in their relationship. So far, was her love and care for him sincere, or was it based on a lie because she wanted to be cared for? The questions spiraling in his mind from this one lie caused the little prince to grow more and more doubtful. Over time, he began to feel lonely and betrayed by the rose, so he decided he needed to leave his planet. In preparation, he carefully cleaned out 2 of his active volcanoes and the 3rd, extinct one too, just to be safe. As he watered the rose one final time, holding back tears, he lifted up the dome to put it over the rose as he said his last goodbye. The rose took a long moment before she apologized to the prince. She promised that she loved him and told him there was no need for him to put the dome over her again. She promised she would be fine without him caring for her anymore. She urged him to leave, turning away so he wouldn't see the tears roll down her petals. The little prince did as he was told, and with the help of a flock of wild birds, he took off into the universe, stopping at 6 asteroids. On each asteroid, he encountered adults that were impossibly strange. Adults that told him much about the universe and the way it works or doesn't work. On the first asteroid, the little prince found himself standing before a king who had no subjects, yet he commanded much authority. He wore a spectacular, breathtaking fur cloak and sat upon a throne of gold and jewels. The king proudly declared that he was the ruler of the universe, with reign over every star the little prince could see. And yet, when the little prince asked the king to command a sunset, the king replied that the sun would, of course, obey him, but that they would have to wait until 7:40. The little prince couldn't help but notice the king searching through an almanac before deciding on the time. The king desperately invited the little prince to stay on his planet and serve as the minister of justice, a role which felt pointless to the little prince, since there was no one on the asteroid to judge. The little prince moved on, confused by the king's strange actions. The second planet was inhabited by a conceited man who only craved praise and admiration, clinging to the idea of being the most admirable person on his strangely unpopulated planet. On the third planet, he encountered a drunkard who couldn't stop drinking because he was desperate to forget the shame he felt caused by drinking. The fourth planet belonged to a businessman. He hardly had a second to spare and muttered "good morning" to the little prince as he greeted him. The businessman was obviously very busy, counting and cataloging the stars visible in the sky. Why did he do that? Well, to own them, of course. Because that would make him rich, he explained, and after he got rich, he could then buy more stars if new ones would be discovered. He had no time to talk because he was dealing with important matters. The fifth asteroid was the smallest yet, and it had just enough room on it for a street lamp and a lamplighter. The lamplighter explained politely that he was just doing his duty. Every day at sunset he would light his lamp, and every day at sunrise he would put it out. But the problem was that due to his tiny planet's incredibly fast rotation, the time between sunsets was incredibly short. So short, in fact, that the lamplighter had barely any time to sleep in between his duties. But the lamplighter wasn't worried about his own well-being. He was only concerned with doing his duty because that's what he'd been told was important. And lastly, the little prince landed on a planet occupied by a geographer. The geographer seemed excited by the little prince's arrival, asking him if he had come to visit the planet. But when the little prince asked him about the planet's geography, the geographer revealed that he didn't actually explore his own planet. He only labeled and cataloged the lands and the seas from his comfortable chair. He asked the little prince if he had any explorers on his planet. When the prince shook his head, the geographer dismissed him, telling him that only geography could be deemed important. Everything else, according to the geographer, was a waste of time. After his encounters with these strange grown-ups, the little prince found himself missing his beloved Rose more and more. He missed her fiery spirit, her demanding requests, her unrelenting love. He realized that he had traveled to all these planets, looking for something to make him feel whole again. But the truth was, he had left the one thing that made him feel whole behind. So he decided to journey back to his planet and see his Rose once more. And so the little prince and the pilot worked day and night on the plane, desperate to get off the tiny planet and return to the little prince's home. After days of hard work, the plane was finally fixed. With a last look around at the sandy desert that had been their home for what felt like forever, the pilot and the little prince climbed aboard and took to the skies once more. They soared through the clouds higher and higher until they could see the little prince's planet far below them. It was a tiny dot in the vast sea of space, but to the little prince it was everything. It was home. As they descended onto the planet's surface, the little prince was overwhelmed with emotion. He was finally home, and as he looked around, he saw his beloved Rose waiting for him, just as she had promised. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he ran to her, throwing his arms around her petals. She smiled at him, her love for him shining brightly in her eyes, and in that moment, the little prince knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. With a heavy heart, the pilot bid the little prince farewell. He knew that he couldn't stay on the planet with him, as he had to return to his own life, but he promised the little prince that he would never forget him. And as he flew off into the sunset, he knew that he would always carry the memory of the little prince and their incredible adventure in his heart.